Sri Shukadeva Goswami said, O King Parikshit, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Hari, being thus worshipped with prayers by the demigods and Lord Brahma, appeared before them. His bodily effulgence resembled the simultaneous rising of thousands of suns. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to continue reading the verses here, including the Sanskrit, until we get to the first purport. So it's quite a lot actually, but we'll go through it quickly. Teneva sahasvave deva pratihate shana nipasyan kam dishta konshnim atmanam chakutovdibum. The vision of all the demigods was blocked by the Lord's effulgence. Thus they could see neither the sky, the directions, the land, nor even themselves, what to speak of seeing the Lord who was present before them. Text 3-7. Virinchito Bhagavan Tristva Sahasavena Tam Tanum Chattam Marakata Svayamam Kunja Gabavune Shanam Taptahi Merva Datena Lasa Kushe Vasasa Prasatna Charu Savangim Sumukim Sundaram Bevam Mahamani Kritena Keyubri Brivanchan Bushtitam Kana Varana Nebata Kapoloshi Mukambujam Gachikala Laparbalasya Haranupura Subitam Kastuba Varanam Lakshmim Viratatim Banam Manlim Soasvaranda Dibi Sasti Muktitim Dibi Upashtitam Tvustva Deva Bhavata Savasva Purusham Param Savamagargani Sakam Savange Abhinam Gati. Now for the translation of all that. Lord Brahma, along with Lord Shiva, saw the crystal clear personal beauty of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. His blackish body resembles a Marakata gem, whose eyes are reddish like the depths of a lotus, who is dressed with garments that are yellow like molten gold, and whose entire body is attractively decorated. They saw his beautiful, smiling, lotus-like face, crowned by a helmet bedecked with valuable jewels. The Lord had attractive eyebrows, and his cheeks are adorned with earrings. Lord Brahma and Lord Shiva saw the belt on the Lord's waist, the bangles on his arms, the necklace on his chest, and the ankle bells on his legs. The Lord is bedecked with flower garlands, his neck is decorated with a Kaustuba gem, and he carries with him the goddess of fortune and his personal weapons. Like his disc and club. When Lord Brahma, along with Lord Shiva and other demigods, thus saw the form of the Lord, they all immediately fell to the ground, offering their obeisances. Shri Brahma Vacha Achacha Janma Siti Samyanya Gunaya Nivana Sukhan Navaya Anon Anime Pragigyana Damne Mahanu Bhavaya Namo Namaste. Lord Brahma said, although you are never born, your appearance and disappearance as an incarnation never cease. You are always free from all material qualities, and you are the shelter of transcendental bliss resembling an ocean. Eternally existing in your transcendental form, you are the supreme subtle of the most extremely subtle. We therefore offer our respectful obeisances unto you, the Supreme, whose existence is inconceivable. So now we get to Prabhupada's purport. The Lord says in the Bhagavad Gita 4:6, Ajo pishtan navayatma bhutanam ishvaro pisan kratin svam adhistvaya sambhavami atmanmaya. Although I am unborn and my transcendental body never deteriorates, and although I am the Lord of all sentient beings, I still appear in every millennium in my original transcendental form. In the following verse in the Gita 4:7, the Lord says, Yada 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 masya gniti bharata bharata jidutaramanda damasya tadatmaham chijamiyaham. Wherever and wherever there is a decline of religious practice of descendants of Bharat and a prominent rise of irreligion, at that time I descend myself. The appearance and disappearance of different forms of incarnations like Lord Krishna and Lord Ram thus take place. Since his incarnations are eternal, the various activities performed by these incarnations are also eternal. The Supreme Personality of Godhead does not appear because he is forced to do so by karma, like ordinary living entities who are forced to accept a certain type of body. It is to be understood that the Lord's body and activities are all transcendental, being free from the contamination of the material modes of nature. These pastimes are transcendental bliss to the Lord. The word apiraganadamne is very significant. There is no limit to the Lord's appearance in different incarnations. All of these incarnations are eternal, blissful, and full of knowledge. Omikyanam tadidam dasha jalangara shalakaya takshom mirisham yena tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manopishtam Sapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Gadapayam Dalati Swapadantikam He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandhu Jagapate Gopisha Gopi Kanta Radha Kanta Mustate Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishnasaya Bhutale Smati Bhaktivedanta Swami Nityanamine Namaste Sasvati Devi Gudavani Paracharine Nivasesha Shunyavadi Prasachade Satarine Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Siddhaita Gadadha Sivasadi Gaura Bhaktivinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. When I first read the verse here about, describing the effulgence and the beauty of actually a form of Lord Vishnu, actually, who appeared on the milk ocean before the demigods, it reminded me a little bit of the Brahma Samhita, of course, which describes the lotus face and the lotus eyes and the wonderful beauty of Lord Krishna. But of course, we must be reminded that this is all Vishnu Tattva incarnations we're dealing with here. Krishna, of course, being the original two-armed form, Supreme Personality of Godhead, but his various expansions and the Vishnu Tattva incarnations, of course, in the Vishnu forms having the four-armed form, but as the verse later on goes to explain the fact that there are many incarnations as well, in variety of different forms, and also animal form as well, such as Lord Nrsingadev or Matsya, and so forth. In fact, the Lord can appear in whatever form he so desires. Why? Because he's God, and he does as he chooses, actually. But we can understand that the Lord takes on the Vishnu forms through the Vaikuntha and the four-armed forms to essentially maintain the universe. Just for example, in the Mat-Tattva, in this place of ignorance, the cosmos actually, which is full of ego and ignorance, that what is not, in fact. The Lord takes his form as Mahavishnu and lies there in the causal ocean. And as he breathes in and out, all the millions of universes are coming, expanding and contracting out of the pores of his skin. Very interesting. But again, we understand that in each of those individual universes, of course, the Supersoul, Paramatma, of course, Vishnu, Krishadakshay Vishnu actually, enters into each and every universe and, of course, lies on the Garbha ocean, like that. Garbhadakshay Vishnu actually. So there he is lying down again, and it is actually this form of Vishnu which is summoned by the demigods. So Krishna himself doesn't actually get involved directly with some of the politics of the demigods, it would appear, whenever they have a problem. For example, if you remember the birth of Lord Krishna, where Mother Bhumi was being abused by the demons or demoniac races that were on the earth at the time, she appealed to the demigods appealed to Lord Brahma, and Lord Brahma appealed to Lord Vishnu. So here we have a situation actually, in a similar way actually, where the demigods have all got together and they decided, well, let's go to the Supreme Manager, we need to be managed, we need to go to a greater authority. It's understood, of course, that unlike human beings, they've got access, of course, to higher, more superior places in the universe, such as Svetadweep, where there's a planet of an ocean of milk. But of course, this is a spiritual planet that is some way accessible to the demigods. So they go there on the beach, on the banks of the ocean, and appeal to the Lord and of course with Lord Brahma's blessings as well, that Lord appears and often fulfills their desires or helps them out in some way. Of course, as we learn later on in this chapter, this time they've appealed to Lord Vishnu because there's this dispute going on with the nectar of immortality, which is quite interesting. I'll talk a little bit about that later. But we have to understand, of course, that demigods have their hierarchy, they have their society. Just like human beings, we have our hierarchy and we have our society, we have our politicians. Probably not a very good example, but we have a political hierarchy in any situation. We have the Prime Minister and there's the UN, and there's different political bodies that people appeal to in times of need. And here we have this diplomatic tension going on across the universe between the demigods and the demonic races about who's going to have this nectar of immortality, because whoever has that has more or less got control, because you're not going to die. So you can imagine it was a rather sought after substance. Of course, the demigods themselves are defined by being much more powerful than human beings, but we understand different forms of demigods are spread throughout the universe in different planets, as we understand. 300 million of them in population, I believe. But these are also counted among the 400,000 different humanoid species across the universe as well. These also include the demigods. But there are relatively lower demigods, like the Upadevas, like Gandharvas and Siddhas, but of course right the way up to Lord Brahma, who of course is the most powerful of demigods is Lord Shiva. And Lord Shiva was also here, present in the purport, which kind of brings us, of course, to the conclusion, the fact that Lord Brahma and Lord Shiva were blinded by the effulgence and struck by the beauty of Lord Vishnu, goes to prove that Lord Vishnu is more powerful, is superior to Lord Brahma and indeed Lord Shiva. But of course, Brahma and Shiva, being the most powerful demigods, always need to be there when petitioning Lord Vishnu. And the lower demigods would obviously access Lord Vishnu through going through their superiors. And that's how it was. Of course, the idea of summoning Lord Vishnu like this is something that the demigods are always able to do. That is their ability, through the blessings of Lord Brahma. But even on the earth, that human beings, often with assistance from the demigods, will be able to get sometimes Lord Vishnu would appear before them in former yugas, Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, where great sacrifices and great austerities would be taking place, where the Lord would appear before them and offer them a benediction. Such austerities and such costly, complicated rituals with complicated mantras are no longer possible in this age of Kali. But we do understand from the scripture that before, millions of years ago, of course, this was indeed possible. The demigods would interact with human beings and, of course, often take part to instruct human beings in these type of sacrifices. We understand, for example, even Narad Muni, in a former life, for example, he was a simple son of a maidservant, a low-class kind of person. He became an orphan when he was very, very young, and all he knew was what he learnt from his mother in his first few years, because they lived in the forest, which was serving and feeding the sages. So therefore, of course, he wasn't Narad Muni then, but in his former life, when he was just left on his own, all he knew was ascetic life. The only men in his life he had seen actually were these ascetics and Babajis and sadhus and sannyasis. So what did he do? He effectively stayed in the forest and went and undergo severe austerities. And due to this, at such a young age, such austerities at such a young age, meditating in the forest, which was according to the method of God realization in that yuga, he had a brief glimpse of the beauty, the lotus form of Lord Vishnu. Of course, with his disc, his club, his chakra and so on, and his gada, and his lotus flower in the hand. And he was so struck by that beauty that he just had a glimpse of Lord Vishnu standing there before him. And of course he fell to the ground and started doing his prayers. But then the Lord disappeared from his sight. And so, of course, he went to do more and more austerities, but this time he didn't come. All he had was this voice in the heart that said to him, you're not yet qualified to see me properly, but it's time for you to go now. But in your next birth, then you will be able to see me whenever you like. Of course, in the next Kalpa, in the next day of Lord Brahma, he took birth again as Narad Muni. And there's a nice little story there, but also an example of the idea that it's not only the demigods actually that are able to get darshan of Lord Vishnu in this way, but it would also be possible with humans. But in the age of Kali, it is virtually impossible. Completely impossible. But on the subject of former yugas, of course we understand that the Lord incarnates in different yugas for different purposes. Of course we know, the Lord's incarnation in the Kali Yuga, for us, of course, is Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And that is how we access the Lord, is through that way, through the chanting of Hare Krishna, and so forth. But in vast periods of time in the past, we can understand that in the Satya Yuga, where there's Matsu, the fish incarnation, or Kurma, Varaha, and the Shingadev, as I previously mentioned. In the Treta Yuga would be Vamanadev and Parashram and Ramchandra. In the Dwapara Yuga, of course, Vishnu actually came in his original form as Lord Krishna, and of course Balaram. And as we enter into the Kali Yuga, of course, there's the Buddha, and of course later on, as we know, the Lord would have come again as the Kalki avatar. That's not for at least another 430 odd thousand years. So hopefully we're not going to be around for that in a future life, because the idea is that we're going to be liberated by then, hopefully. But if we are around to see that, then we would probably be quite happy to see the Kalki avatar come on his white horse and wipe out the remaining extremely low-class human beings that will be left by then, that basically scavengers and eating each other no more than 3 foot high. And the earth will be virtually a desert by then as well. A bit like Watford on a Saturday night, just to give you an idea. It's on its way, though, isn't it, in a way? Because we're already in the Kali Yuga, these things are already on their way to a degree, but in small ways, into a smaller percentage or to a smaller degree but actually ultimately the conclusion of the Kali Yuga, after the golden age of Lord Chaitanya, which of course is 10,000 years, so things will get better, but then after that, it's more or less a slippery slope. So, of course, the idea was that we hopefully will be liberated from the cycle of birth and death before the next 10,000 years is over. Otherwise, if you're on the earth after the next 10,000 years, it really could be unpleasant. Well, it will be unpleasant, actually. But it's gradual as well. Civilizations come and go just as they always have done. But the idea is that gradually those civilizations will become more and more degraded, more and more materialistic, and to the point where we'll be worse than animals, actually. It'd be an insult to call a human being an animal because of the moral degradation that would be included in that. Of course, I mentioned that in Vamanadev and other incarnations like Kurma, they are significant actually because they have roles in the ocean, obtaining the nectar of immortality that I mentioned earlier. Very, very important roles actually, and I'll go into that. Yes, I'll mention that now. But first of all, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the introduction to chapter 6, which links into that, because this is the first verse, of course, of a new chapter, and Prabhupada usually writes an introduction, of course, to that. So this is what part of what Prabhupada writes. He says, "The Lord is never separated from these universes by time, space, or circumstances. He is the chief and the pradhana." That pradhana, of course, being the sum and bonum of an origin of all material energy. "Although he is the beginning, the middle, and the end of the material creation, the idea of pantheism conceived by Mayavad philosophers has no validity. The Supreme Personality of Godhead controls the entire material manifestation through his subordinate agent, the external energy. Because of his inconceivable transcendental position, he is always master of the material energy like that. So, and then the purport then goes to say, the Supreme Personality of Godhead advised the demigods to make a peace proposal to the demons, so that after formulating a truce, the demigods and demons could churn the ocean of milk. So there we go. So that kind of brings us up to date, really, with, for example, other incarnations like Kurma, the huge tortoise incarnation that actually allowed Mount Mandala to go on his back in order that this mountain would be churned somehow within the ocean of milk, thus bringing, and with help from Vashuki, the snake, with the purpose, of course, of churning up various different things like Airavata the elephant and many other things, and out eventually they would, of course, get the nectar of immortality in a pot. Of course, that's the story. I think that comes later on in this chapter, and therefore I didn't want to go into that in any more detail right now. Shri Shri Radha Goklananda Ki Jai, Shri Shri Sita Ram Lakshman Hanuman Ki Jai, Shri Shri Gaunitai Ki Jai. Yes, I didn't want to go into the details of the churning of the ocean of milk, because that will probably come in later verses for other people to talk about. My main focus, of course, is the various incarnations of the Lord, so I'll link the two together. So as I said before, so Kurma incarnation actually had a role in the churning of the ocean of milk. This is obviously Vishnu's idea. He says, if you do this, do this, you churn the ocean using this mountain and so on and so forth, then you'll get the nectar. So all the hierarchy of the universe, including the demigods and the demons, had a truce. They decided, they did some diplomacy, and they said, let's work together and then we can share it out equally. So of course, what happened, so all kinds of things came out, but the demigods in particular were full of self-restraint, and they didn't actually take anything until they had this nectar of immortality before them. But what happens when you get kind of pious and impious races together after a truce, and suddenly on the table is this nectar of immortality? What happens is they start fighting over it. Now you have it, no, I'm going to have it. So a war broke out. But actually, once again, there had to be a truce that was necessary. So they decided, this is where Mohini Murti actually came, another incarnation of the Lord, and to my knowledge, the only female incarnation of the Lord, actually. And of course, unsurprisingly, the most beautiful one as well, by far. And of course, her purpose, of course, really was to make sure that the demons didn't get their hands on this nectar of immortality. Because if the idea, of course, is that if the demons got hold of it, then you'd have a population of immortal demons, and that's not a situation that Lord Brahma, or indeed Lord Vishnu, or the Lord wanted at all, or Lord Shiva, for that matter. Lord Shiva's role is, of course, to help the demons, but not necessarily to let them take over the universe. So there was a lot at stake here. The fate of the entire universe was at stake, and all the different demigod races and demoniac races basically were prepared to do anything. But then this most beautiful incarnation of the Lord, who was first seen by Lord Shiva, and Lord Shiva saw Mohini Murti. And I won't go into the details of that, but this extremely, the most beautiful woman times a million, basically. And and Lord Shiva was absolutely besotted by her when he saw her there. And of course, when she appeared before the demigods and the demons, they were also absolutely besotted by this yet another incarnation of the Lord in a very, very beautiful female form. And so she basically diplomatically said, well, everyone sit down in rows, you're going to be served. Sounds like Prasadam in Mayapur, doesn't it? But it's like they all sat down in rows, all the demigods and the demons, and she said, I'll distribute the nectar to everyone equally. And the demons, who were actually on the verge of, I think they'd already stolen the nectar actually, but when they saw this Mohini Murti, their jaws dropped. They said, yes, we'll do whatever you say. Whatever you say, we'd agree. She says, okay, demons, do you promise that whatever we agree to, you will keep to that promise? Whatever arrangement I make with this nectar of immortality, you will kind of accept. And the demons are, yeah. I think they were obviously concentrating on her at that point. Anyway, so they all sat down in rows, and of course, Mohini Murti, being an incarnation of the Lord, said, okay, we'll do a few demigods first, we'll let them get their nectar, and don't worry, I'll come to you soon. So there she was, giving this, I don't know how it was done, but serving basically the chief demigods with a cup of nectar. And they were all very happy once they got the nectar. And the demons were a bit patient to begin with. They thought, okay, she's very beautiful, we'll give her the benefit of the doubt. And as time went by, they started going, well, so far she's only been serving the demigods. And they started to realise, and it was suddenly it got less and less, there was hardly any left. So Rahu actually got suspicious. He kind of cottoned on here. The problem was the demons couldn't do anything about it because they'd already made a promise. And so even though they were kind of atheistic in nature, they impious in nature as well, still they had vows and things like that, and they would lose their power should they break their vow. So they had to keep to their promise, and they couldn't go to war with the demigods at this point. But nevertheless, Rahu just thought, I'm having none of this, I want some of that nectar. I don't trust this Mohini very much anymore, beautiful as she may be. So he disguised himself as one of the demigods and sat there between the sun and the moon demigods. He kind of pushed his way in, pushed in the queue, and thought, right, I'm going to get my nectar now. So Mohini Murti came along with her ladle, and it was Rahu's turn. She thought he was a demigod, and then, but at the last minute she realised, oh my God, he's a demon, what am I doing feeding this demon? And the nectar got as far as his neck, and suddenly, she got her chakra out and took his neck off, took his head off, because of course the whole plan was not to let any of the demons have this nectar of immortality. So there he was, dead on the floor, and just she served a few more demigods, and we've run out now. Oh, never mind. Of course, the demigods were actually outraged the demons were outraged by this, and I think there was a bit of a scoffle after that. But anyway, what could they do? The demigods by that time were already immortal, so they'd won the game by the benediction of the Lord and his incarnations, including Kurma actually, like that. But of course, what happened to Rahu? Rahu's head was immortal because his head had already had the nectar at that point. So the body perished, but the head of Rahu, of course, remained immortal. And we understand this, of course, to be, the Rahu, which is basically, for an astronomer, you'd have to say to them, or an astrologer, you'd have to say it's the north and south nodes of the moon, is Rahu's head. Or you could say that the Rahu is not Chandraloka, is not the moon, but it's close to the moon. It's between the earth and the moon, because that's where Rahu sat when he received his nectar of immortality. Thus, whenever they say there's an eclipse, when you see that the moon goes dark, and of course, even though it's the daytime, it goes dark, that's understood to be Rahu, and a time for demons. So often in Indian culture, people would actually not go outside or close the windows and not look at an eclipse, because you're looking at Rahu, which is understood to be a demon. But of course, Rahu is not to be confused with the moon, Chandraloka, which of course is an effulgent heavenly planet. Like that. So going back a little bit to the final section I wanted to talk about, going back to the section here. The next incarnation, of course, remember, is Vamanadev. The demons actually were, although they lost the nectar of immortality, they did actually go on to become very, very powerful. By the time you get to the Treta Yuga, they did establish a lot of power in the universe. Obviously, they were very powerful at the time. And because they were headed up by Bali Maharaj, and Bali there's actually a country called Bali as well, interesting enough. Bali, of course, he was the king of the demons, but for his relative piety, actually, because the thing about him is that demons, just like Ravana and so forth, and Ranikashipu, they also performed austerities, is they knew about these things, and they knew scriptures and austerities, and even did prayers, often to Lord Shiva, to attain power. And they did get that. And in Bali was one of those who was a demon with certain good qualities, but ultimately was king of the Suric races. but needed to be disposed of because he was taking over the universe. So, of course, as previously mentioned, Varmanadev, the dwarf incarnation of the Lord, had to come and basically trick him, because we know the story where the Bali, being kind of understanding the Vedic culture and understanding virtue and so forth, saw this Brahmin, who was actually Varmanadev, and said, "I'll give you whatever you want." So he said, "Okay, I'll just have 3 steps of land." And of course, most of us already know the story. Those 3 steps were not just 3 small physical steps, but actually by the 3rd step, because he was the Lord, he actually stepped over all the planets and the universe. And therefore Bali, having to keep to his vow, had to give the whole universe to Varmanadev. And therefore the demons lost their place in the universe there as the hierarchy, and had to, as we understand actually, there's always been wars, but whenever the demons lose the wars, they always have to occupy the hellish regions or the subterranean planets, and where they don't get any sun. Like that. So the demonic races basically are defeated by the demigods in different ways, through the help, importantly for the help and the various incarnations of the Lord. In other words, if you've got the biggest friend of yours in the school playground, no one else is going to touch you. So similarly, because Lord Brahma and the other kind of demigods had Lord Vishnu on their side, even though they were enemies, the demonic races, because the big man himself is on your side, you cannot lose. That's the idea. Of course, just one final point, and that's in connection with the introduction to this chapter, where Prabhupada writes, I'll say it once again, "The idea of pantheism conceived by Mayavad philosophers has no validity." Of course, he was talking here about the effulgence of the Lord. We hear from the original verse we were looking at today that the Lord's effulgence was so bright they couldn't even look at him. And I thought this is quite an interesting connection here with Mayavad philosophy, because often when people talk about the oneness of God, they talk about the energy of God and the oneness of the universe and so forth. But usually, Mayavadis are characterized by those who do not say that the God has a personality or a form. They are occupied by the sense of oneness. And this sense of oneness is actually the effulgence of the Lord. You don't see the form of the Lord, but all you see is a bright white light. Just like, for example, this light here, the chandelier. Therefore the source, if it was nighttime, you wouldn't get anything from outside, so therefore the source of light in this room would be from the light bulb. But if you're facing away from the light bulb, you would only see the effulgence of the light. You wouldn't see the light bulb itself. Or, of course, the sun. The source of all light is coming from the sun, ultimately. But if you face away from the sun, you may try to deny that there is a form of a sun there, and you only see the sun's light. You may even see a lot of shadows as well, but you would see the light, but you wouldn't attribute it to a personal God. But we are different from the Mayavad philosophers, because we do attribute the sun and bonum of all things and all variety and form that we experience. We attribute this to a personal God, and indeed his forms and incarnations. In many ways, actually, when we read about the pastimes of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, we actually learn that Mayavad philosophy is offensive to us, because we understand that the form and variety and relationships we experience in this world must have an origin of some type. How can the origin of our experience of form and relationships and so forth that we experience come from simply an energy or a formula or an effulgence or a light which has no form? How can form come from formlessness? And this, of course, going back to the difference between the demigods and the demons, we understand that the character, the way that Prabhupada describes actually in other cantos and other purports, is that the demigods were ultimately devotees of some type, devotees of Vishnu or incarnations of the various incarnations of the Lord. Whereas demoniac races are also very much more powerful than human beings, but were ultimately atheistic. But they would understand that there was an energy behind everything. That's where they get their power from. But they would never attribute it to a personality, and that's a big difference. It is a big difference. I'll give you an example. I don't want to go into details, but I attended a recent conference, and it was all about different forms of yoga in Hindu kind of culture, Hatha yoga and Ashtanga yoga, Kripa yoga, Kundalini yoga, and Bhakti yoga, this yoga, that yoga, Samadhi, and all these different aspects of different yogas, Karma yoga, Jnana yoga, and so forth. And basically, the whole day was people playing with these hundreds of different Sanskrit words. And the temptation, I think, for most of the people that were listening to all of this for the first time, or indeed those who are already of a Mayavad persuasion, could only make sense of it all by saying, well, you just follow your own path and you get to the same result, which is actually a Mayavad type of impersonal philosophy. The idea that, well, you follow whatever yoga you do, you create your own reality, and then you end up in the same place as everyone else. But everyone's got a different way of getting to that same oneness. And that the only variety, the conception of variety, is an illusion. And once you dispel your idea that there is any variety, that's when you receive your self-realization. But anyway, at the end of the conference, I did get a chance to speak, although in an open forum. I basically just said, well, there are different forms of yogas, but it's not that it is a yoga ladder, but that ladder is not horizontal, that ladder is vertical. There's a hierarchy of different types of yoga. You cannot compare, for example, Hatha yoga, that's the breathing exercises, to pure bhakti. But you can, as a pure bhakti person, because I remember there was a lot of yoga teachers in there, I didn't want to offend anyone, and it wasn't my intention to. You can be a bhakti yogi, but also practice very well Hatha yoga, like that. However, there is something higher from the heart, which of course is loving and serving God. And that the best way to do this is to understand that there is a personal God, and that personal God has a form because he's a person, and he has the ability, whenever he wishes, he takes birth on the earth, or makes himself visible or accessible to people on the earth, according to time, place and circumstance. Thus he takes on different forms. But ultimately it's all the same supreme personality of Godhead. So I'll stop there. Any points or questions? Geeta, you got your hand up there.